muy duro lo que estaba diciendo. Entonces, continúa Ivette. Disculpen todos y todas la interrupción, pero había que hacer un ajuste. Ok. Muy duro lo que estaba diciendo.
Listo, Ivette, adelante. Está cerrado tu micrófono. Listo.
Bueno, ahora sí. Bueno, vamos a recapitular lo que estaba diciendo. Lo que se pretende aquí es hacer una lectura de la propuesta y la interpretación del doctor Johnson a partir de lo que yo digo son dos coordenadas importantes a la hora de analizar los conceptos que se quiera dentro de la obra de Schelling, ¿no? Esas dos coordenadas, dijimos, es la primera que nos dice que la filosofía negativa hace posible o es necesaria para que se pueda dar o se llegue a dar la propuesta de la filosofía positiva. Es necesaria la negativa, o sea que la negativa precede necesariamente a la positiva, y la otra coordenada era que la filosofía trascendental también precede necesariamente a los planteamientos de la filosofía de la naturaleza. También habíamos dicho, habíamos dado lo que presento en el texto como antecedente general, que son los puntos a partir de los cuales el doctor Johnson va a construir su propia propuesta, partiendo de la expresión Deus sive natura, ¿no? Los habíamos enumerados. Lo último que dije fue lo que se puede decir en torno al primer punto que él presenta, como que la naturaleza y Dios no son sinónimos, sino que tienen que tratar como conceptos excluyentes, ¿no? Y habíamos hablado de eso. El segundo punto es, dice el doctor, favorecer a la natura o a un real material natural sin Dios. Ahora sí, sobre este punto. No puede favorecerse inmediatamente un real material sin Dios, pues si se quiere establecer un pensamiento sobre ello, se presupone siempre y de antemano las condiciones de toda pensabilidad, o sea, primeramente y antes de todo a la filosofía trascendental. Asimismo, respecto al tercer punto el tercer punto de la caracterización del doctor, dice él, concebir a la natura naturata como región ontológica, seres materiales y empíricamente investigables por las ciencias, y rechazar la inmaterialidad de la natura naturans. Respecto a esto, una natura naturata sin natura naturans es una física especulativa sin intuición objetiva, por tanto, sin intuición intelectual, es decir, una reflexión de la natura naturata en tanto que presupone las condiciones del pensar. Aún las ciencias empíricas como la física o la química, y que pensando algo vienen a afirmar mediante el pensamiento la mera materia real que supuestamente se colocaría más allá del mismo pensar, lo cual sería un contrasentido. Nosotros nos preguntamos, ¿qué consecuencias tiene esta ceguera en las coordenadas doctrinales en clave arquitectónica? Respuesta. La imposibilidad del hecho de que se conciba como posible una sublimación de la ontología inmanente crítica de la ontología del conflicto, la segunda especie de monismo. Antecedente. Usted concluye. Primero, Deus sive natura no debe ser una disjunción incluyente, sino excluyente. Segundo, las ciencias modernas piden que se elija a la natura en lugar de Dios, pues este último posee fuerzas ocultas inobservables y poderes misteriosos en la naturaleza. Toda metodología y epistemología de las ciencias naturales experimentales debe renunciar a Dios o a la natura naturans. Tercero, según las ciencias empíricas de la naturaleza debe entenderse como natura naturata, de manera que se logre evitar la sustitución de la investigación empírica por la filosófica. La natura naturans invita a fantasías que eclipsan e ignoran los resultados de las ciencias empíricas naturales. Cuarto, para Schelling, la alternativa a la naturaleza determinista es una naturaleza libre y autodeterminante. Vuestra solución es considerar a una naturaleza indeterminada que permita dar cuenta de la autodeterminación de la conciencia. Refutación de estos 5 puntos. Primero, Deus sive natura es una unidad diferenciada en la unidad, por lo que no es ni una disyunción incluyente, porque la unidad excluye la diferencia, ni una disyunción excluyente, porque la diferencia se resuelve en la unidad, por lo que la sentencia significa que es tanto una disyunción incluyente, porque la unidad se resuelve en la unidad, en los productos del genio y la naturaleza, y al mismo tiempo una disyunción excluyente, porque la unidad no es igual a sus productos, aunque por medio de ellos se intuye a sí misma en la forma de su potencia más alta, la autoconciencia, condicionante de la filosofía de la naturaleza, aunque no de la naturaleza. Es decir, hay que tener bien en cuenta, una cosa es la naturaleza, otra cosa es la autoconciencia y una muy diferente, la filosofía de la naturaleza. Segundo, en efecto, respecto al segundo punto, en efecto, las ciencias modernas exigen y exigirán siempre la cancelación de Dios para poner en su lugar a la naturaleza, pues para estas ciencias, al no haberse elevado al punto de la autoconciencia, les parecerá siempre y necesariamente un poder misterioso e incomprensible aquella natura naturans, es decir, sin intuición intelectual, resulta consecuente que jamás haya existido en ellos la intuición objetiva de la naturaleza y que se vean embargados por la oscuridad, deambulando en el misterio y reposando en el desconocimiento. Hay una cita de las investigaciones en donde habla Schelling sobre la libertad y dice algo así como que cualquiera que haya probado la libertad, que la conozca, puede comprender y va a desear que todo lo que le rodea sea también libertad y vida, ¿no? Pero aquel que no conoce esa libertad, pues nunca va a poder comprender pues parte de su propuesta. La tercera réplica. El tercer punto de lo que nos había dicho usted era, según las ciencias empíricas de la naturaleza debe entenderse como natura naturata, de manera que se logre evitar la sustitución de la investigación empírica por la filosófica. La natura naturans invita a fantasías que eclipsan e ignoran los resultados de las ciencias empíricas naturales. Sobre esto, la natura naturans de la filosofía de Schelling no sustituye la ciencia empírica, ni a la ciencia empírica le es exigida la ciencia de la naturaleza en cuanto empírica. El no conocimiento de la natura naturans por parte del científico empírico no implica la sustitución de una u otra ciencia. Y así, al no tener en cuenta la intuición intelectual, condición de toda pensabilidad, es igualmente algo necesario e irreprochable el hecho de que el científico natural vea en la intuición objetiva meras fantasías y fabricaciones abstractas sin sentido y que, por tanto, crea que la intuición objetiva o natura natural ignore o eclipse los resultados de las ciencias empíricas. Respecto al punto 4 de lo que nos había dicho el doctor, dice: para Schelling, la alternativa a la naturaleza determinista es una naturaleza libre y autodeterminante. Vuestra solución es considerar la naturaleza indeterminada que permita dar cuenta de la autodeterminación de la conciencia. Sobre este punto, En efecto, la natura naturans es en Schelling algo autodeterminante, pero si vuestra opción es insertar una naturaleza indeterminada, lo que ha puesto no ha sido sino algo indiferente a toda determinación o autodeterminación, o sea, ha asumido el principio de la filosofía de la identidad de Schelling en clave empírica. Ahora bien, si asume y pone más elementos condicionantes, aparte de ese elemento indeterminado que permitiría la explicación de la génesis de la autodeterminación de la subjetividad, aún debe, no obstante, explicar cómo de aquella indeterminación de la naturaleza surgen las determinaciones, con lo que se le asignaría una tarea racional conceptual. El concepto de indeterminabilidad determinada sería determinada y dejaría de ser indeterminada. Sería consecuentemente una ontología del conflicto del tipo del que le reprochaba Schelling y del que, como hemos visto, no participa. Esto es lo que llevó a Schelling al giro de 1809 y no a una explicitación más honda de lo anteriormente establecido. Es decir, lo que lo llevó a esta reformulación fue el conflicto de hacer comprendible cómo de lo indeterminado puede surgir lo determinado, cómo se puede determinar lo indeterminado sin que pierda su indeterminabilidad. Conclusiones generales. ¿Qué se puede decir a partir de lo que hemos dicho? ¿Cómo lo puedes concluir? Bueno, encontramos que hay una parcialidad de su punto de vista sobre el sistema total de Schelling al considerar solo a la filosofía positiva y conservar de la negativa solo la filosofía natural. Asimismo, hay una parcialidad al abordar la filosofía natural sin considerar por igual a la filosofía trascendental. Tercero, este segundo modo de proceder incompleto, es decir, sin considerar el sistema trascendental y el de la naturaleza, ocasiona ciertas interpretaciones extrañas. ¿Por qué? O sea, estas interpretaciones, como por ejemplo hay expresiones en el texto que el doctor compartió con nosotros en las que se dice que Schelling opta por un realismo robusto o que hay un rechazo por la subjetividad, ¿no? Que hay ciertas tendencias que ven como en este subjetivismo, algo que hay que rechazar, ¿no? Y entonces esto es extraño, no podría concordar, porque primero, la filosofía trascendental ya está ensamblada con la filosofía natural, en la misma filosofía trascendental, en la teoría de la intuición productiva, y dos, la filosofía natural ya está ensamblada con la filosofía trascendental en la misma filosofía natural, en la deducción del proceso dinámico, en el magnetismo, electricidad y el proceso químico, y en la defensa de su teoría de las potencias, que elevada a la máxima expresión, resulta en la autoconciencia. Y cuarto, finalmente, sin el monismo en conflicto ni el monismo de la pura unidad, vuestra consideración acerca de Dios es también extraña, porque cree que al desespiritualizarlo, quitarle su actividad infinita o natura naturans, todavía podría mantenerse la doctrina de una natura naturante. En resumen, ¿qué es lo que se está diciendo en el texto, así como tal? Primero, que es necesario o que no es verdad que Schelling abandone los planteamientos del idealismo trascendental, sino que la filosofía trascendental es una condición necesaria para dar cuenta de cualquier concepto, tanto de la filosofía de la naturaleza como de la filosofía positiva. Por otra parte, y también lo que estamos diciendo es que, que no se puede hablar de una natura naturante, natura naturans, porque ya se estaría presuponiendo a la filosofía trascendental en el sentido de que si nosotros queremos hablar de una naturaleza indeterminada, pues el simple hecho de que ya estamos hablando de eso, de que ya se está haciendo filosofía de la naturaleza, pues ahí ya está supuesta la filosofía trascendental. O sea, para hacer filosofía de la naturaleza es necesario primero pues dar cuenta de la posibilidad de esta subjetividad, ¿no? Además, existe un problema a la hora de querer hablar de esta natura naturante indeterminada, porque el simple hecho de nombrarla, de escribir sobre ello, ya la está determinando, y entonces sigue sin resolverse el problema de la relación de lo indeterminado con lo determinado, porque al hablar de ello ya se está determinando y entonces pues se pierde lo indeterminado. Y es por eso que se les reprocha esta noción de natura naturans, digo de natura naturantes y natura naturans, que sería como indeterminada. Y pues en términos generales, esta es la réplica que había preparado, no sé qué puedan decir.
Muchas gracias. No, sí, fuiste muy aguda y sistemática, ¿no? La lectura de Schelling te ha entrenado muy bien. Entonces, sí, yo también tenía puntos muy similares de dudas sobre, porque a mí también me habían enseñado a Schelling así unitario como tú lo presentas. Entonces, sí, se me hacía también, comparto estas visiones, pero vamos a dar oportunidad a ver qué responde el doctor Johnston, y yo también haré después un comentario más breve que el tuyo, que yo preparé sobre la pregunta que yo inauguré la clase, bueno, la sesión pasada sobre la relación entre idealismo y materialismo. Pero bueno, adelante. Doctor Johnston.
So I would like to begin by thanking Yvette for having put together this incredibly thoughtful, precise, rich response to my text. I am very grateful to her for that. And I was wondering, in my early senility or absent-mindedness, how long was the PDF text of mine that was circulated? Was it 43 pages in total length? All right, so one thing to save time, if nothing else, I will send to Gerardo that text that all of you had access to is a shortened version of an even longer piece. And the original is 87 pages. And one of the things I cut from the version I shared is a much more detailed, really text by text, year by year exegesis of Schelling's intellectual itinerary from, the mid 1790s up to right before his death. And I think a lot of the material contained in that lengthier exegesis, and I'll identify it for Gerardo in terms of the stretch of the longer text so that people don't have to reread things they've already read. But much of what I do in there involves really attempting to substantiate my somewhat critical portrayal of Schelling by focusing on the theme of, as Hegel first coins it in his 1801, the difference between Fichte's and Schelling's system of philosophy, the quote-unquote identity of identity and difference. And using that motif in this lengthier reconstruction, missing from the version of my text that all of you had access to show that much more often than not, on balance, Schelling invariably, whatever lip service is paid to difference in this equation, tends to lapse into privileging identity to such an extent that he even at certain points does go in for again, I think very Spinoza-inspired epiphenomenalist perspective on anything and everything other than this absolute identity with a capital I. Although, given his mercurial protean character as a thinker over the years, there are moments where he doesn't do that. And I'm tempted to say of Schelling what Bill Clinton famously, to his detriment, said about starting in the late 1990s, Chinese efforts to construct a massive firewall for internet censorship. where Clinton described it as like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And working with Schelling, part of the fascination, but also the frustration in working on him, it involves this. And of course, it's what Hegel famously is getting at when, rather unkindly, he said in public in his Berlin lectures on the history of philosophy that Schelling was guilty of conducting his philosophical education on the public stage. But there are a number of things right now that I think I can say to address not all, certainly not all, but at least some of the points that Yvette very helpfully raised. And I should also add here as a caveat, my Spanish passive comprehension is still a bit rusty, but I felt I got enough to have a good sense of how to respond. But if there are any inaccuracies in my construals of Yvette's positions, Yvette or whoever else, please, by all means, disabuse me of my confusion. All right, so one major qualification before I get well and truly underway. I should say that my engagement with Schelling here, of course, in part does involve a concern with carrying out an accurate reconstruction of him from the standpoint of intellectually responsible history of philosophy. But at the same time, my attempt to construct what I think is a defensible interpretation of Schelling's work, with focus on certain themes and periods rather than others, is really to look at him in terms of what does he have to offer a standpoint such as mine, which in certain ways is very distant from or alien in relation to his own sensibilities. Now, some of this has to do with differences that are already visible internal to German idealism. I remember last week at one point, I mentioned how, well, if you look at the big four of German idealism from the standpoint of epistemology, one finds that you have a Kant-Hegel axis that eschews any recourse to anything along the lines of so-called intellectual intuition versus a Fichtean and Schellingian axis that involves indeed various types of recourse to what initially appears in the guise of this intellectual intuition, first sketched by Kant in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. Now, in addition, you have Kant and Hegel here who both believe that as soon as you permit yourself recourse to something along the lines of the supposed power of intellectual intuition, all bets are off, and there's no way to fend off philosophy regressing back behind Kant's first critique, and you end up with a series of competing, speculative metaphysical systems, none of which can land the decisive death blow against the others and proclaim victory in some process of adjudication where we would sort out the comparative plausibility and implausibility of those different systems. And along with this, you then have also informing my not entirely historically focused revisitation of Schelling, concerns which have to do with both the epistemological and methodological sensibilities of the modern natural science that Schelling was, certainly well acquainted with for his time, but there are limits to it just based on how much has transpired in those disciplines since the lifetimes of any of the big four of German idealism. And to take as an example, one of the ways in which this consideration that I just mentioned informs, for instance, my criticisms of Schelling's recourse to, distinctions that are either direct citations of or variations on Spinoza's distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata, right? So, with Schelling, you often find that he'll make the claim that, well, for any of the empirical experimental natural scientists, for practitioners of what Schelling in the late 1790s calls quote unquote empirical physics, as basically modern empirical experimental natural science in its entirety, he repeatedly, wants to claim that, well, ultimately, the very existence of the natura naturata that are taken for granted as the givens disclosed to the observation and experimentation of the sciences, empirical physics, with their explanatory jurisdiction. In order to account for the existence of any of those instances of natura naturata, you have to appeal to this productive, generative ground or force beyond, behind, or beneath the facade of immediately accessible given objects and processes dealt with by the sciences. But for the natural scientists, they say, no, I mean, that's just a recipe for projecting, speculative, philosophical, even, of course, as Schelling later, mythological or theosophical pictures onto reality that there's no epistemological justification for doing. And so if you ask, for instance, a physicist or a chemist, where did, particle or molecule X come from? They're not going to, immediately say, well, I guess we have to invoke something like, this generative productive power, whether it's Spinoza's Natura Naturans, Bergson's Elan Vital, or anything in that vein. They'd say, no. I mean, then what you have to do is you have to tell it a kind of, temporal story of Genesis, right? Say these other then eventuate this given to another way down, or if they would acknowledge that at some point we might, hit the explanatory spade turning bedrock of, all right, we come up against an ultimate, to use the later Schelling's language, of the positive philosophy, a kind of ultimate factical thatness that, we can't get back behind. It's unhintergehbar, as Schelling would put it. Well, if and when we run up against that, we should say that really is a last resort. And that, all other things being equal, in almost all instances, we are generally going to be able to tell an explanatory story that does not require recourse to what, again, I can't help but see as it's ultimately a sort of occult force, not some sort of mysterious spirit-like or even mind-like underlying generative productive power. No, you can account for that generative productive power just strictly within the lone plane of immanence of natura naturata. And if there are certain points within there that we might at some juncture run up against and say, all right, this seems to be a kind of ultimate unhintergehbar thatness. That I think for the sort of epistemological and scientific sensibilities I have in mind, even there it would be, well, we have to just wait to see whether this is just a temporary blockage and we can get further back behind this. Or if not, well, this is an ultimate limit to our knowledge. There's no license for filling it in with any positive, speculative or ontological metaphysical claims about something more behind it that we somehow have access to. They would say, where's the epistemological license? What justifies that? And honestly, I have trouble seeing how you could license that without throwing the door wide open to just a proliferating multitude of confabulations about this precise, characteristics of this X that supposedly is beyond, behind, or beneath what we do have, it seems, actual epistemological, methodological access to. So that's sort of the bigger, at the level of big picture philosophical sensibilities, motivation, something that in terms of my work, I would ask to be borne in mind. Now, as for my work that's focused much more specifically on Schelling, both in the shorter and longer versions of this text, and again, I'll share the latter with everyone via Gerardo soon, I would say that, one of the things I'm trying to do apropos Schelling is to find a way to capture his protean mercurial character as a thinker that periodizes him somewhat differently than the various standard periodizations of his work in the Schelling literature currently offer. And I think by following this red thread of how he handles the identity difference relationship over his career, that one can find that there are Schellings that are very close to what I want, who show up, in the late 1790s with certain articulations of the Natur philosophy. certain aspects of 1800 system of transcendental idealism. And then, as I point out to you, the third and final draft of the unfinished Weltalter project. And this is where not only do you have, as I argue, this conflict ontological Schelling, but also a Schelling who I think is less prone to a kind of more Spinozistic metaphysical outlook that not only involves what I think is an epistemological and methodologically suspect appeal to natura naturans, that in my view, that's part of what then, it doesn't make it inevitable, but it certainly helps lead into what you get with the late Schelling, especially its philosophies, mythology, and revelation, which just seems like Christian theosophy kind of run amok, and in fact is part of course, what attracted the Berlin authorities to having Schelling come to replace Hegel after Hegel's death and quote unquote stamp out the dragon seed of Hegelianism. I think that with my way of periodizing Schelling, it involves saying he doesn't actually ever. He has certain temporarily stable systemizations of his thought, but those quickly get relations, etc. And so, I certainly don't think there's any single Schellingian system. And hence, in a way, if you reckon with the full sweep of his corpus, I think, like I do, you are, by virtue of the inconsistencies, forced to cherry pick, forced to selectively reconstruct, and in a way that I don't think Schelling, and I don't think Schelling is, and I don't think he could be, faithful to all of the different claims that he makes over his career. Unlike someone like Hegel, who is remarkably consistent, once especially he hits his stride with the phenomenology up through his death. Yes, there are maybe some minor oscillations, but there's much greater architectonic stability and constancy as compared with Schelling. And I don't think that that's a caricature of Schelling. I think he justifiably is viewed as, very volatile as a thinker over the years. Now, in particular, I'm also interested in him because, of course, I see a lot of what I'm trying to do in my work as to taking into account post-19th century developments in fields such as the sciences, what a contemporary reactualization of the, partly nature philosophical informed efforts of Schelling and Hegel in particular as representatives of kind of the later second phase of German idealism, a redeployment of their legacy that nonetheless takes into account things that Hegel admitted all philosophers are children of their time that they couldn't foresee. Here, what I think with Schelling, one of the things that I feel is careful to do is to bring out, in part through references to his debts to Spinoza, bring out how, because there are readings of Schelling, especially the Schelling of the Naturphilosophie of the late 1790s, you say, oh, look, you have talking about nature and about natural science, and oh, well, this is very congenial to any kind of materialist or naturalist sensibility. And to show that really that Schelling is the false friend, the faux ami, of any sense of materialism or naturalism that we understand these words to mean. And that in fact, he is really, even during that period, especially when he waxes more Spinozistic, I think ultimately he is a spiritualist, a panpsychist, and I think there's lots of textual evidence supporting that. Of course, I guess we could take the debate to, ultimately, are you willing to bite the bullet of panpsychism, for instance, or not, in accepting, a lot of the claims that Schelling wants to make through not only the Spinoza appeals, but through, for instance, in his attempt in part to placate Fichte at certain moments, his kind of short-circuiting of the difference between, on the one hand, natura naturans, and on the other hand, sapient subjectivity as kind of the highest power within the hierarchy of powers, in terms of the different strata of existence, as Schelling's work sometimes identifies them. I think, in a contemporary version of this, Zizek, when he, and part of this is also informed by debates that I have been having with him recently about his recourses to Schelling in conjunction with quantum physics, right? Where, Zizek basically wants to map the Freiheitsstift's version of the distinction between ground and existence onto the quantum dynamic of the collapse of the wave function, where we go from this ground of shadowy potentialities, and then through the collapse of the wave function, you have the level of existence akin to natura naturata emerge as the domain of stabilized objects and entities, that populate reality as we're familiar with it. But, in terms of him also endorsing this, in a way, this direct equivalence between this, quantum version of Schellingian ground and then full-fledged subjectivity, that, apart from the issue of, all right, well, this does seem to involve treating the ultimate basis of reality itself as either a subject or very subject-like, again, something that is really ominously, eerily close to panpsychism. You also just have, again, the epistemological problem. I mean, for instance, to carry out, all right, take any subjective phenomena you want, and to successfully carry out a reduction that would substantiate this claim that somehow, for instance, free subjectivity is the resurgence within the field of existence of this ground, and say in Zizek's quantum terms. No, I mean, there was an attempt in this vein in the late 80s by Roger Penrose to come up with a quantum physicalist account of mind, but it was panned by both philosophers and quantum physicists. And part of the problem is there's no envisionable approach that we could think of that would allow us to substantiate that in any epistemologically responsible fashion. It can only ever remain this giant reductive promissory note that nobody knows how we would end up successfully cashing it in. Now, a few other points, that I want to make, and then in the interest of time for conversation, I should say that, like I mentioned a little while ago, and it came up too in Yvette's response. So in a certain way, for me, one of the pieces of Schelling's corpus that I feel the greatest affinity with is actually the 1800 system of transcendental idealism, but with a number of important caveats. So in that text, of course, you have Schelling at certain moments present the relationship between, at that moment, what are for him the two main branches of his approach to philosophy, or his view of what a system would involve. You have transcendental philosophy a la Kant and Fichte on the one side, and then you have Schelling's own Naturphilosophie as an addition to this on the other. And it seems as though in 1800, and I think this is in part due to the politics of the Fichte-Schelling relationship at that moment, you have Schelling say, well, in a way, these are equiprimordial. They're sort of like mutually complementary or supporting. And that Naturphilosophie, involves proceeding from the real to the ideal, and then transcendental philosophy goes in the opposite direction from the ideal to the real. And that, in a way, transcendental philosophy provides the epistemology, Naturphilosophie provides the ontology, and these are like recto and verso, or again, two sides of the same coin. And there it seems, and again, to have recourse to Spinoza, I mean, as with Spinoza, you have this idea of substance as appearing to us, at least, necessarily.
Sorry, could you say that again?
I'm sorry, Siri, for some reason, thought I was asking her a question. You have, the sense of you don't have a fully developed historical or genetic approach. You have instead this notion that, in a way, the complementary, relationship, the parallelism between, transcendental philosophy and Naturphilosophie is very much akin to, I think, the dual aspect part of Spinoza's dual aspect monism, where you have one reality, but it necessarily appears to us, but just appears, refracted into this unbridgeable divide between the attributes of thinking and extension. And I think, really one of the things I think Hegel already does in terms of taking inspiration from, Schelling's 1800 STI, among other texts, is that Hegel more thoroughly kind of historicizes this. And one way to read the entire arc of Hegel's Realphilosophie as volumes 2 and 3 of the encyclopedia is it tells a kind of, in part, historical story of how you get from pre/non-subjective nature in its most basic and rudimentary forms all the way through the development, not only of, for instance, sentient animal organisms, but sapient human subjects, and also, of course, the larger inter and transsubjective, socio-historical formations that those subjects are generative of, which is Geist in its fuller sense for Hegel. And as all of you know, I mean, I put my Hegelian cards quite clearly on the table last week. I think that what Hegel does then is, in a very different way from Schelling here, show how you could tell this story, which I think would be compatible with things, despite Hegel supposedly being opposed to even the notion of evolution, of the kind of natural history of the very genesis of the I and the we of Geist. And with the latter, with Geist being for Hegel, how do you get out of nature this dimension that arises from it that then takes on a life of its own and no longer can be understood in purely naturalistic terms, even though you have a strictly naturalistic account of its genesis? And that's something which I think, Hegel, in a way, very subtly, without saying it in so many words, one of the things that he does with kind of, as it were, geneticizing the schema of something like the STI, whereas with Schelling, what he does instead is 1 year later, in 1800's presentation of My System of Philosophy, he goes the alternate route of saying that, well, and here we don't know whether he was being honest or not, or was being autobiographically revisionary. But he says in the opening paragraphs of 1801's presentation of My System of Philosophy, oh, I already had the Identitätsphilosophy in my back pocket in a year ago in System of Transcendental Idealism, but I didn't pull it out and directly foreground it, but I'm going to do so now. And, I don't think this is entirely fair, because he was still trying, I think, in 1800 to seduce Fichte into accepting Naturphilosophy as a kind of co-equal partner with transcendental philosophy. That didn't work. And then instead he goes to the identity philosophy, which is of course vehemently anti-Fichtean. And of course, the 1801 presentation is his Declaration of Independence of Fichte. And very much like Spinoza's dual aspect monism, it's as though you just have this, kind of timeless, eternal identity with a capital I, and then it appears refracted into these two dimensions that are dealt with in STI. But it ultimately, those two are just mere appearances relative to this absolute identity. And again, from my own perspective, however anachronistic, but I don't think fully anachronistic, I think you could already get a critique of this, a robust critique of this Schelling, out of a combination of Kant and Hegel. But certainly, if we're going to be talking about a philosophy that has the kinds of engagements with the natural sciences that Schelling should be credited with helping to pioneer, you're once again, I think, back to facing some very difficult questions about epistemology, methodology, whether you would really want to go in for, reducing the subject to being just, in a sense, the resurgence of some sort of primordial ontological ground, whether likewise you would want to bite the bullet of panpsychism or a kind of spiritualism. Those, of course, are points one can still debate and have to do with, I think, fundamental intuitions that we have as philosophers that kind of ground how we approach philosophy itself. But let's see, there's probably some other things that I should say, because again, Yvette's presentation was extremely rich. And also, of course, I'm sure I'm missing things due to my, extremely out of practice Spanish. But maybe I should stop myself so that we have some time for a bit of open conversation instead of me just talking on and on.
Muy bien, ok. Right.
Yeah.
Pues sí, yo creo que contestó lo esencial. Habría que esperar y sería muy bueno tener la versión completa del texto, donde a lo mejor algunas de las críticas de Yvette son respondidas y otras no, pero no importa de todas formas, porque ella fue muy, muy sistemática y sí nos puso en una posición donde vemos que sacar consecuencias materialistas de Schelling pues tendría una dificultad mayor, ¿no? De la inicialmente presentada. Yo solo escribí 3 páginas, todavía no están en formato, por eso no las comparto, son en borrador, las escribí anoche, entonces las leeré brevemente. Es sobre mi pregunta que le hice la clase pasada al doctor. Sí, entonces dice: Si materialismo quiere decir algo contra idealismo, ello no puede ser sino una forma de demostrar que lo que el idealismo pretende dar por entendido sigue en realidad sin entenderse y que para entenderlo es preciso emprender un desarrollo teórico que demuestre ser distinto y que demuestre entender mejor. Nadie puede lograr ser materialista con reivindicaciones de la prioridad de la materia o cosas por el estilo. Marx al menos jamás siguió ese camino. Lo que Stirner reprochaba al idealismo es someter a los hombres a las ideas como algo sagrado. Propone, pues, despreciar lo sagrado y Marx lo acusa entonces de hiperidealista. Pero la razón que nos da no puede llevar a engaño. Ese, citó a Marx, desprecio por lo sagrado en cuanto tal que con el fin de cita, con el que se ha investido lo real, no es sino la forma en que se desprecia el esfuerzo por comprender la realidad en cuestión. Tras todas estas páginas, lo único que se puede dar por sentado, las páginas donde saco el texto de Marx, es que para el materialismo, el idealismo aparece como una solución de facilidad que encubre y entorpece una tarea científica. Nada sabemos respecto a si esa tarea necesita ser materialista, a su vez, o le vale sencillamente con ser científica. En resumen, puede concluirse que no es posible saber lo que nombra la palabra materialismo si no se llega a demostrar que el idealismo mismo es una solución de facilidad, que cuando pretende haberse hecho cargo de alguna determinación, ésta ha sufrido ya algún tipo de desgaste, de atraco y de inefabilización o nihilización. Este espejismo de progreso teórico, caracterizado en general como una ilusión hegeliana, tiene que resultar difícil de probar respecto a un pensador como Hegel, que en la fenomenología se ha vanagloriado precisamente del cuidado de la determinación en honor de la paciencia del concepto. El materialismo tiene su causa perdida si no logra demostrar que la paciencia del concepto hegeliana esconde una pereza teórica fundamental, y ello pese a que Hegel no deja de acusar a Kant y a los filósofos críticos de perezosos. También al amor se le reprocha su pereza. El amor, dice Hegel en la fenomenología, no sabe mantener firmes las determinaciones. Pero el amor al menos sabe esperar, lo que demuestra de todos modos una paciencia real. Mientras que el concepto hegeliano, que jamás deja de trabajar para proporcionarse la determinación, demuestra más bien la impaciencia de un Dios que, incapaz de aguardar la llegada de un mundo, función que en la historia de la filosofía se ha llamado sensibilidad, hubiera decidido crearlo. Entonces, yo lo que quisiera es que nos explicaras dónde Hegel falla y por qué no quedarnos nada más en Hegel o bien en un desarrollo científico, porque es necesario hablar de materialismo trascendental si la paciencia del concepto hegeliana ya hubiera resultados o fuera suficiente para resolver los problemas que le serían propios al materialismo, pero solo aparentemente, ¿no? Como Stirner creía, pero Marx le dice, no, por allá no va, ¿no? Entonces, más allá de la mera afirmación de la materia o de la prioridad de la naturaleza, ¿en dónde está el punto en que uno habría que torcerle el cuello a Schelling y a Hegel y hacerlos decir algo monstruoso, como dijera Deleuze, ¿no? Hacerlos tener un hijo monstruoso, que en este caso sería el materialismo trascendental. Esa sería mi pregunta.
All right, I'm going to need a little help with this.
Okay.
I was able to follow parts of it, but
Okay.
yeah.
The idea is, according to Marx, you have to not just refutate, as Stirner does, or Feuerbach does, dogmatically, idealism, because of the illusions it uncovers, but you have to explain exactly why it is necessary to amplify the Hegel's patience of the concept far beyond the limits of idealism. What is necessary, if Hegel is right, to invoke materialism? Why you have to, I'm going to use the rude expression of Hegel, but I love it. Why you have to get Hegel from behind and make him give birth to a monstrous child that is transcendental materialism?
This is funny. I even sometimes have been accused by people of being a crypto-Deleuzian. And of course, you're using Deleuze's idea of buggering figures in the history of philosophy so as to produce monstrous offspring. Well, here, there's a connection with, Gerardo, the question that you helpfully asked last week too, with making reference to Marx and Marx's understanding of materialism and how my use of the word might relate there. And, you might recall that I drew everyone's attention to, in particular, not the 11th and final, but the first of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, in which he identifies everyone from the ancient Greek atomists up to Feuerbach himself as promulgating versions of quote unquote contemplative materialism. And that for Marx, this was insufficient in part because such materialism tried to explain away rather than explain, to reduce or eliminate so much of what we take to be essential to the human condition that it inevitably repels people from materialism and drives them back into the arms of more traditional versions of idealism. And that for Marx, a viable materialism has to include within itself somehow a non-reductive account of those very phenomena that make idealism appealing to at least some of us, right? How to materialistically account for the very temptation of idealism itself, rather than simply to dismiss it and externally combat it, right? This for me is, a very important consideration in terms of, since obviously I think the type of materialism which I am committed to is non-reductive in the sense of it is a materialism that would have to include within itself a theory of subjectivity, rather than, as is so often the case with, and of course with reductive or eliminative varieties of materialism, a materialism which would seek to dismiss everything we associate with subjectivity as mere appearance in the sense of being illusory, epiphenomenal, causally inefficacious, fictive, etc. There very clearly, I do not situate myself as any kind. I'm vehemently opposed to this kind of reductive or epiphenomenalist sort of materialism. But what I would say here in particular is that perhaps it would be more helpful, and I've toyed with this in a number of texts. I think sometimes it would be more helpful for me to identify the position I'm defending, and I think especially here in what I'm doing with Schelling, as perhaps better described even as not so much transcendental materialism, but understanding that as synonymous with another phrase, really, dialectical naturalism. And what I mean by that phrase, dialectical naturalism, is that, all right, we clearly have reason to believe, for a number of reasons, that, and of course Schelling and Hegel are already somewhat aware of this, but we are much more so now, that there is a vast, by comparison with the relatively brief period of the existence of Homo sapiens, that natural history writ large is this vast expanse in which the bulk of what we're dealing with is pre or non-subjective. It precedes the genesis of sentience, let alone sapience, and that we are an extremely recent late arrival on the scene, in terms of the cosmos as we know it, and that furthermore, right. This is already, one of the ways in which Marx and Engels talk about the idealism versus materialism fault line is that you can go back to the Parmenidean distinction, but then identification of thinking and being, and you can say, well, idealism prioritizes thinking over being in several ways, and materialism, by contrast, of course, prioritizes being over thinking. And so there is a being prior to thinking. Thinking is itself just being. Thinking itself is a moment, an outgrowth, a crystallization or reflection of being. And, in that sense, even though the sort of materialism I advocate is vehemently anti-reductive, anti-epiphenomenalist, etc., there's still an acknowledgement based on scientific and historical considerations that any viable account of something along the lines of cogito-like transcendental subjectivity would have to account for the nature immanent genesis of this sort of subject, which itself, once it comes on the scene, cannot be understood using the resources of those disciplines whose explanatory jurisdiction is nature in the sense we understand it in the natural sciences. And so in a way, and put in using kind of Hegelian jargon, dialectical naturalism, argues that ultimately to account for the, to non-reductively account for full-fledged subjectivity as understood in the modern philosophical sense in a way that is still both materialist and naturalist, that what you need is an account of in a way, a nature that is at least in and through us partially self-denaturalizing, that is generative of structures and dynamics which become distinctive in relation to the structures and dynamics which prevail over pre or non-subjective sectors of nature. And this is ultimately what I'm after in the simplest, most directive terms. And for this, I do think that, given what I said, for instance, earlier about Hegel's Realphilosophy as contrasted with Schelling in 1800 and 1801, for example, this is something which I think a more fully kind of historical and genetic approach that I think is better represented by Hegel, who's quite different from Schelling on this score, is much more congenial or conducive to. But one has to also bear in mind that Marx, in terms of his idea of a historical materialism distinct from contemplative materialism, Engels's furtherance of that in the guise of a larger, even more ambitious dialectical materialism, that they share in common these anti-reductive sensibilities, but at the same time could still claim to be, for instance, materialist or naturalist, insofar as there is ultimately the sense of, on balance, even though we're not reducing away, thinking apart from being subjectivity over and above objectivity, we are at the same time acknowledging that this itself has to be seen as a genetic outgrowth of that larger being that transcends the merely subjective, or of a nature that pre-exists us by vast stretches, etc. But I also think too, in a more classically Marxist vein, your question calls for, in addition to this, you would have to have a kind of socio-historically informed account of why it is that certain instances in the, as Marx and Engels like to talk about it, this, going back to the ancient Greeks, this perennial conflict between, and this is especially Engels's narrative, between materialism and idealism as the fundamental primary contradiction in Mau's terms, or fundamental fault line of the Western philosophical tradition. I think that there's also, as Marx in particular would emphasize, the need to account for why specific versions of materialism or idealism come to enjoy certain prominence or effect within particular social contexts in which these are part and parcel of what Marx would see as the superstructural, since he identifies philosophy very much with superstructure, part of the superstructural scaffolding of a given, social configuration. So that would be another set of considerations that would have to be borne in mind here, if that helps.
Yeah, because in my research, I try to understand how you can go inside Hegel and go out, because I really have hard dealing with the assertion that the finite doesn't have real existence. And this is what you have to deconstruct or inverse or whatever, but an inversion within Hegel is still idealism. So there are no inversions in this system. So you have to do another thing completely. I think that that is what Deleuze is doing in Difference and Repetition, trying another method to go out of Hegel, and that's what I am very interested in what you do as a thinker, because I think that you find another strand of being inside these monsters and still trying to to get some ground on the materialist stand. But okay, I can stop here my intervention.
Oh, but I want to add, based on what you said. So, you know, as you're aware, one of the things that I emphasize that I think is responsible for a lot of what I consider to be inaccurate renditions of Hegel is a refusal on the part of interpreters to very carefully, to respect what for Schelling and Hegel is a very, important distinction between whether you call it objective or absolute idealism on the one hand, and then subjective idealism on the other. In addition, if there was just one place that I could refer to in Hegel's corpus in response to the worry that you have right here, it would be in the science of logic, this extended, what Hegel entitles, and it's in book 1, it's in the Doctrine of Being, this extended, really long footnote almost, what he calls a remark on idealism. And he there, more clearly than anywhere else in his corpus, I think, in just a handful of pages, he says, when I am talking about idealism, I'm not speaking of it as it features in the standard sense of, well, you've got the difference between realism over here and idealism over here, right? And for Hegel, what he means by idealism is that, if we think in terms of, for instance, if we had an ontology that was, and of course, when you make reference to someone like Deleuze and ideas of difference, which go back to, among other sources, Saussure, already with Hegel, you could say there's an anticipation of the Saussure who's important for, for instance, French structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers, where there is difference without positive terms. And there's I don't know if Hegel will go that far, but I think what he does make clear in this extended remark on idealism in the science of logic is that for Hegel, when he says that, everything is ideal, what he means is it's not that everything is mental or everything is in a mind or mediated by a mind, as we would understand this in terms of subjective idealism or traditional idealism, but instead that everything is what it is, not just on its own as a freestanding atom, but in and through its relations with all other relata. And it's only in and through the mediation of the relations that particular things are what they are. So it's a kind of, it's more an organicist style holism in which you have this teeming multitude of relata, and they are what they are thanks to their relations with each other. None of them can be what it is just, as a freestanding, immediate, self-sufficient island, just given in its pure ipseity. Hegel says, no, it's the relational mediation of all things that I mean when I speak of idealism in my sense, which is very different from saying everything is mind, everything is mental content, everything is mediated by a minded finite subject. No, he makes very clear that when he uses the word idealism, and we could ask, why does he still hold to the very term, right? And, is this not less, it's this not more misleading than helpful? Oh, and I realized too that I'm getting some text messages, some chat messages with questions too. I'm sorry if I haven't answered this yet. But one might say against what I'm doing here, well, maybe I'm trying to present, as an exegesis or a faithful reconstruction of Hegel, what is actually, whether we want to call it a deconstruction, a subversion, etc. Perhaps that's the case, but at least consciously, I think I still have very good textual grounds in Hegel himself for saying that the whole problematic for Hegel of idealism versus realism in any of its traditional guises, when he speaks of himself as an idealist, he's using the word in a very idiosyncratic way, such that, I think it's, we might want to use a different term, but, I think Hegel was, even as an idealist, robustly realist. Just for him,
okay.
Yeah. And here, so I have Luis has asked me a couple of. So here, can I read your question, Luis, to
yes,
everybody?
Of course. I didn't want to speak because you are really into the discussion. So maybe if you can read them or I can tell them to you. So yeah, my point is, since the last session, I have this question in the basic concepts of the discussion about monism or an absolute substance that it's in the bottom of the whole discussion. It's an ontological or metaphysical assumption. And in the after Hegel's and Marx's death, became this project of the critique of historical reason of Dilthey. And one of the main critiques is to this idea of the experience of an absolute.
Yes.
And in this sense, Dilthey names these previous positions as forms of idealism. So my question is how nowadays we can affirm this experience of an absolute, because you mentioned the last session, no, that the absolute, it's the whole kind of relations that we have. Yes, but why to name that an absolute?
Yeah, it's, well, I think that here, in a way, you know, the term absolute, and I think especially as Hegel uses it. Yeah, I mean, one could say that for Hegel, in a way, the absolute is the interconnected concatenation of failed attempts to get at the absolute. In a way, it is the network of interrelations between problematically one-sided positions or perspectives that nonetheless, although they all involve distortions, they all also involve these kernels of truth. And that, you know, part of why for Hegel, you only, you know, gain access to this after traversing, you know, why you don't, as he puts it, immediately intuit the absolute intellectually like a shot from a pistol, as he critiques, you know, among others, Schelling for, as he claims doing. Why it's only, you know, by passing through this lengthy process that involves carrying alongside not just the history of an individual self-consciousness and its development, but ultimately, you know, already in the phenomenology, a reconstruction of human history, however inadequate, partial, and flawed Hegel's version of it is there in 1806, 1807. And, you know, for him, of course, when we get to, like in the phenomenology, the concluding chapter, the infamous, notorious, you know, absolute knowing, you know, where in a way, all that it does is it just says, all right, now having traversed this lengthy path, this way of despair, as he calls it, these stations of the cross, of the different, you know, figures or shapes of consciousness and spirit. We now, with this owl of Minerva hindsight, look back over it, and we can see how these different one-sided perspectives and their one-sidedness necessarily do themselves in and give rise to successive attempts to correct for the flaws with the previous position, which in turn generates, you know, further difficulties, which call for further permutations of in the evolution of mind and spirit. That, yeah, I mean, he still is, I do think there's a bit of a mystery as to, okay, why continue to use the term absolute here? But I think here it's in part Hegel wanting to push back against figures like Schelling and to say, the only absolute ultimately is going to be this interconnected network of non-absolute, partial, one-sided, flawed, failed perspectives that all at the same time still contain, each of them, its own grain of truth too. And that gathering these up and properly positioning themselves with respect to each other is the best that we can do. And that furthermore, you know, when Hegel talks about, for instance, absolute knowing and associates it with the infinitude of the concept, I mean, the way I understand his sort of talk there is not that he's saying, okay, when we get to the final chapter of the phenomenology, for example, at this point, we have attained absolute knowing in the sense of we have exhaustively cataloged everything under the sun that could be an object of knowledge, that we've constructed an encyclopedia as a closed book that supposedly has, you know, squeezed all of the juice out of reality in terms of what we can explain. No, I think instead it's to be understood as, you know, among other things, and against especially Kant, now we've shown that there is nothing in reality that is inherently withdrawn from, refractory to the indefinite further extension of our categorially and conceptually mediated knowing, that we can continue to make inroads into the real without ever hitting a point like the thing in itself that just will forever resist us, elude our grasp, etc. But that's very different from saying we've gotten to the point where we've literally expanded knowledge to the whatever, however we would think of this, the outer limits of reality, and there's nothing left to explain, right? And hence why he also says absolute knowing and not absolute knowledge. But again, we come back to this question of why does Hegel retain the old language? Whether with Gerardo, the term idealism, with your question, the term absolute, and here I'm shooting from the hip. This just came to me, and I don't know if I want to adhere to it, but I want to float this at least as a trial balloon. So. With Gerardo mentioning Deleuze, we also have Derrida, and one has to bear in mind that one of the things that Deleuze and Derrida spent a lot of time studying in their early education, and it's one of the things that led Derrida to move from Algeria to Paris. It was to study with Jean Hippolyte, the great mid-century French Hegel scholar and translator, and that of course it's perhaps no accident that the inventor of deconstruction started out as a very devoted reader of Hegel, working with Hippolyte on this. And that I think sometimes there's this kind of anticipation of the deconstructive strategy of appropriating certain terms and not just abandoning them, but inflecting them differently. And in so doing, problematizing the assumptions bound up with their standard use. That I do think is part of Hegel's relationship to philosophical language. And in that way too, I mean, when Hegel talks about the absolute, we often think, oh, that's the sign of his megalomaniacal, hubris, his idea that, he could, but when you realize if he means by absolute what I've indicated in both last week and in conversation now, it's almost to say that, well, no, it's to insist on the absolute here is to insist that we cannot but absolutize from our present standpoint in relation to our story about how we, became what we are and reached this juncture. But that's due to, Hegel's insistence that, as he states very clearly when invoking the owl of Minerva in the 1821 preface to the Philosophy of Right, we remain children of our time and we have no predictive power vis-a-vis the future. And so in a way, we're forced to absolutize from our present standpoint, but for Hegel with an implicit awareness that the very absolute that we construct is going to have to be altered as, beyond our powers of prediction, given our situatedness, history continues to relentlessly unfold. And Hegel is not, I think, a proponent of the end of history in the way that he's often caricatured as being by, especially I think certain right-wing Hegelian interpreters. But yeah, so that's something that might be at play here as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más. Arturo levantó la mano. No sé si quieras hacerla y vamos cerrando para no abusar del tiempo del Dr. Johnston.
Well, Arturo put me through my Schelling and Hegel paces very, very effectively last week, so I'm very curious as to what he has for me now.
Okay.
Yes, I'm also curious what will come out of this. Well, first, very good. I was also very eager to hear from you about transcendental materialism, and I also have the feeling, I don't know if it's a feeling or just I was expecting more. Because, in the 20th century, we got accustomed to thinking that Hegel, and especially after Marx, that Hegel was not a materialist. And despite he was very, he prepared the terrain for materialism, he's nonetheless an idealist. Because when you're reading about this Hegel, that, it's the phenomenology of spirit and the whole system is nothing but the history of our mistakes and our incapacity to grasp totality, and we just gather everything together, we follow our own path, and in the end we have like this sort of aggregate. But Hegel is thinking in an encyclopedia, and there is a rationale inside it. and at the very end, you also tend to stress the fact that the absolute is nothing but our standpoint. And it seems to me that this is a very you criticize, I think, somewhere. I have read something from you, many things, but I'm very disordered. I haven't kept notes about it. I don't know, but I remember you criticizing, I think it was random for being types of caffeinated Hegel, or a version of Hegel. But I think that taking away absolute from Hegel and trying to rely or trying to construct a concept of the absolute and of reason just retrospectively seems to me like a very deflationary view of Hegel. Like, well, we commit mistakes. We are constantly struggling, trying to interpret reality, and in the end, we make what we can, and we always sort of cheat because we impose some reason retroactively, and we do not recognize the immanent rationality of the absolute. So that's my first remark, which is not wrong. It's just a matter of acknowledging or not. But it seems to me it happens very much after Marx and Nietzsche and Heidegger that we read the classics, especially German idealism, as as philosophers that were still covered by a foggy consciousness from the 19th century, but there is a rational kernel, and we can save it through epistemology or through even psychoanalysis, in which you say, no, there is no immanent rationality. It's just what we put rückwirkend, and that's like cheating on Hegel.
Well, before I forget, because I don't trust my short-term memory at this late in the day, but what I wanted to say just here is there is another sense of the absolute that I do hold on to, that it was very helpful when you referenced Brandom and his version of a kind of deflationary Hegelianism, where really I think it's more Wilfrid Sellars than anyone else who is playing the key role in how Brandom reads Hegel. And to bring out the difference between myself and someone like this Brandom. So I could begin by saying, in language closer to Hegel's own, that, and this is where we also come to one of the issues that I brought out with Schelling, this whole problem of mistakes, of errors, and how do you account for those given the sort of absolute idealism that both Schelling and Hegel are after. And Schelling's very interesting registration of this in a way that's much more direct, even though in passing, than what you get in Hegel. And you have to do a lot more work, I think, to extract from Hegel. But one sense is you could say that our mistaken thinking about being is still being's mistaken thinking about itself. And that's, another sense of, the absolute in terms of, it's not as though thinking exists in some elsewhere separate from being. Right? Thinking is itself immanent to and is a moment of being. And, if we think of the absolute in this sense, where ultimately, even if we consider, for instance, the Parmenidean identification that still involves a distinction between thinking and being, ultimately the notion that thinking itself is internal to and is a moment of being. There's, I think, some of Hegel's talk about the absolute is meant to signal that sort of position. And if we take that sort of position seriously, even though me stating it right now is an oversimplification, that when you look at someone like Brandom and, related to him, you have Pippin have recourse to this. And I would say that there's actually ended up being, so Zizek has been going after Brandom pretty fiercely lately. And like in the Reading Hegel book that just came out that he co-authored with Frank Ruda and Agon Hamza, his chapter there is very much devoted to critiquing Brandom's The Spirit of Trust. And Brandom's reading of Hegel there is highly reliant on Wilfrid Sellars' distinction between the order of reasons and the order of causes. The way that someone like Brandom uses that Sellarsian distinction between reasons and causes is antithetical to this immanentist dimension of the absolute in Hegel, where the very thinking of being is itself being thinking itself. Whereas with someone like Brandom, it said, well, you've got, you know, being here at the level of the order of causes and thinking here at the level of the order of reasons. And, you know, it's in a way an absolute, you know, if there's an absolute in Brandom, it's the absolutization of that distinction following Sellers, which I think is an anti-Hegelian move, despite him claiming that this is the key for making sense of Hegel. So I don't know if that helps at all. But
yes, perfectly. Yeah. And just a remark, it's not going to be a question. We also laugh at this kind of interventions from our students. I don't have a question. It's just a commentary, and they speak and speak and speak and speak. So I'm one of those guys. But I will try to restrain myself. I think that's the main contribution of Schelling is not positive. It's not a pun. It's not being satisfied with contradiction, I think. And what he's trying to do all the time, especially from in the middle period, the Freiheitsschrift, is that he needs contradiction because that gives life to the system, especially in nature. But at the same time, his very vague ideas about indifference and ultimately the separation between the ground of existence, or the ground and existence, tries to pinpoint, or at least signals, some sort of dissatisfaction, both with unity and both with plurality as contradiction. And that's for example, he's very aware that materialism needs, and in this way, I think the young Marx is thinking via Feuerbach, there is sensibility. There is another type of sensibility, and he's taking this, I think, from Kant, from his analysis of mathematics, because pure intuitions are not the intuition of the absolute. They are not empirical concepts. They are constructed intuitions. So in a way, he's saving intuition, but not outside the concept. And for me, this is some type of thinking. I would call it very closely to contemporary logic. I know that's not pretty fair, but I would say that he's pushing a sort of multi-valued logic, especially when he says that you can see the world either from the standpoint of nature and or the standpoint of subjectivity, or even the positive and negative philosophy, or ground and existence, trying to show that there is not a single line in which you can add up or combine contradictions, but sometimes it ramifies. So I would be more, I would be happier with Hegel if he would accept a ramified dialectics. I mean, that it's not a single way always coming back, but there are different lines, not in a rhizomatic way. I distrust this concept, but I think that the main idea behind the real or matter in Schelling is that things remain relatively exterior among themselves. That means that basic, not only nature, but also in history, there are things that you cannot understand beforehand, but you have to make the experiment, so to speak. And he I don't know if it's in the in which lections, I think Stuttgart Privatvorlesungen, I think, he said that philosophy has to conduct experiments. It's not about thinking what has happened. It's not about anticipating what is going to happen. Is that many problems cannot be solved directly with reason or with logic, but with the will. I mean, experimenting. And this call to face the future through experimentation, and not because there is a limit in concepts in themselves, but because you have to act, right? And I know Hegel would say that more or less the same. Am Anfang war die Tat. They are all sons of Goethe. They follow this, but the Tat in Schelling is a manipulation of things, I would say. and not necessarily an apprehension of things. And I think this is just, it's not really superseding or contradicting Hegel. It's just like extending the space he's trying to lay a different logic, not with only two values, because he just sees, and I don't think he masters this, but he comes to see the limitation of a single negation or a single difference, or the possibility of arranging the totality of nature in a single timeline. That's what could be the contribution of Schelling to materialism.
Yeah, and I want to say that in general, I'm sympathetic to these ways of approaching Schelling where you can take certain facets, and one of the things I find attractive about him is precisely that there are all of these really promising insights scattered throughout his corpus. But at the same time, this is the negative side of my ambivalent relationship to him. I feel nonetheless those are interspersed throughout a body of work that also has these other sides to it that I think are very criticism worthy, in the ways that I try and lay out, in various texts, including, the one that has served as the basis for our meetings last week and today. I think that with Schelling, especially, when we talk about his sensitivity to these differences that don't seem to allow for any kind of unification, or the standard sense we have of what Hegel does when he sublates something, where it's tethered to this, which I think is a caricature of Hegel, that it's always this three-part dance step of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I don't think that Hegel invariably is looking to kind of blur the differences in terms of some synthesis. I think that Hegel too often sits with contradiction in a way that Schelling does as well. But I think for Hegel, he believes that especially once we take a certain historical or genetic approach, that more often than not we find that what initially appear as insurmountable differences or irreconcilable contradictions, that we can, in a sense, even if in their present version we take them to have something of the irreconcilable about them, we can nonetheless get back behind them by explaining how this very gap came to be, or how it is that being was generative of this discrepancy, which once it emerges does not seem to admit of being finessed in a synthesizing fashion, as a lot of people think the Hegelian dialectic is all about. And this is perhaps a little bit vague, but at the same time, I must admit, I'm hearing screaming from the children on the other side of the door. So pretty soon I'm going to go out there and see if there's blood on the floor. I want to say, since I think Gerardo indicated we're moving towards a close here, just how much I have appreciated getting to talk with all of you. I mean, my hope is that at some point in person this will be possible, but for now Zoom is certainly better than nothing, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, like Yvette and all of you. This has been really an enjoyable and valuable experience for me, so thank you.
Okay, te agradecemos, Adrian. We thank you for your time, your dedication to us. We hope having you soon here in person, as soon as we also here in Mexico normalize our academic activities, because nowadays they are still very strange. So, gracias a todos por venir. La siguiente sesión ya va a ser dentro de un mes, el 16 de mayo. Yo voy a leer un texto también herético, materialista herético, sobre Kant. No sobre todo Kant, sobre la refutación del idealismo. Adrian lo conoce, ese texto, y viene complementado con cosas que él generosamente me compartió. Y tendremos a Ignacio, perdón, no recuerdo el apellido.
Ignacio Rojas Godina.
Ignacio Rojas Godina de la UAP, como el replicante en la sesión de la semana posterior a esta del 16, que sería la del 23, no, estamos hablando del 17, perdón, martes 17 y martes 24. Son las dos sesiones de la segunda entrega de esto. Vamos a expedir constancias de la participación de este primer módulo del seminario. Para quienes no nos puedan acompañar en mayo, pues tengan la constancia de esta asistencia, pero si no está la constancia, sí requieren la asistencia a los dos módulos, o sea, a las dos sesiones del módulo, ¿no? A la conferencia y a la réplica, para que puedan acceder a esto. Les agradecemos. En cuanto los tengamos, se los haremos llegar. Muchas gracias a todos. Ya no abusamos más de su tiempo. Perdonen que se nos fue un poquito la mano. Y nos vemos en el siguiente módulo para la demostración del materialismo trascendental en la refutación del idealismo de Kant. Nos vemos.
And Gerardo, you will have, it's already waiting for you in your email inbox, the even longer version of the monism and mistakes piece with the, especially the lengthy reconstruction of Schelling year by year.
I'm gonna upload it. Also, some books I have of you, the New German Idealism, the first volume of the trilogy, and I'm waiting. I'm really waiting for the third volume of the trilogy.
This is the second. The third, I need a few more years to get written. I have chapters, but it will take me a little while.
Okay, so I will upload volume 1 and 2 to the materials, and some of your articles that you developed, some ideas that you exposed here, and I'm gonna also upload this material. Okay, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
No.
Absolutely.
Thank you too for your generosity.
Oh,
Nos vemos en mayo,
please.
chicos, chicas. Gracias por asistir. Espero que les
My
haya
pleasure.
gustado. Chao.
Thank
I
you
hope to
very
see
much.
you all
Take
in person
care.
soon.
Take
Take care.